Chapter 15 of A Short Life of Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. A Short Life of Abraham Lincoln by John G. Nicolay. Chapter 15. Davis's proclamation for privateers, Lincoln's proclamation of blockade, the call for 3 years' volunteers, Southern military preparations, rebel capital moved to Richmond, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas admitted to Confederate States, desertion of Army and Navy officers, Union troops fortify Virginia shore of the Potomac, concentration at Harper's Ferry, concentration at Fortress Monroe and Cairo, English neutrality, Seward's 21st of May dispatch, Lincoln's corrections, preliminary skirmishes, forward to Richmond, plan of McDowell's campaign. From the slower political developments in the border slave states, we must return and follow up the primary hostilities of the rebellion: the bombardment of Sumter, President Lincoln's call for troops, the Baltimore riot, the burning of Harper's Ferry Armory and Norfolk Navy Yard, and the interruption of railroad communication, which, for nearly a week, isolated the capital and threatened it with siege and possible capture, fully demonstrated the beginning of serious civil war. Jefferson Davis's proclamation on April 17th of intention to issue letters of marque was met 2 days later by President Lincoln's counter proclamation instituting a blockade of the Southern ports and declaring that privateers would be held amenable to the laws against piracy. His first call for 75,000 3-months militia was dictated as to numbers by the sudden emergency, and as to form and term of service by the provisions of the Act of 1795. It needed only a few days to show that this form of enlistment was both cumbrous and inadequate, and the creation of a more powerful army was almost immediately begun. On May 3d a new proclamation was issued, calling into service 42,034 3 years volunteers, 22,714 enlisted men to add 10 regiments to the regular army, and 18,000 seamen for blockade service, a total immediate increase of 82,748, swelling the entire military establishment to an army of 156,861 and a navy of 25,000. No express authority of law yet existed for these measures, but President Lincoln took the responsibility of ordering them, trusting that Congress would legalize his acts. His confidence was entirely justified. At the special session which met under his proclamation on the 4th of July, these acts were declared valid, and he was authorized, moreover, to raise an army of 1,000,000 men and $250 millions in money to carry on the war and suppress the rebellion, while other legislation conferred upon him supplementary authority to meet the emergency. Meanwhile, the first effort of the governors of the loyal states was to furnish their quotas under the first call for militia. This was easy enough as to men. It required only a few days to fill the regiments and forward them to the state capitals and principal cities. But to arm and equip them for the field on the spur of the moment was a difficult task which involved much confusion and delay, even though existing armories and foundries pushed their work to the utmost and new ones were established. Under the militia call, the governors appointed all the officers required by their respective quotas, from company lieutenant to major general of division, while under the new call for 3 years volunteers, their authority was limited to the simple organization of regiments. In the South, War preparation also immediately became active. All the indications are that up to their attack on Sumter the Southern leaders hoped to effect separation through concession and compromise by the North. That hope, of course, disappeared with South Carolina's opening guns, and the Confederate government made what haste it could to meet the ordeal it dreaded even while it had provoked it. The rebel Congress was hastily called together, and passed acts recognizing war and regulating privateering, admitting Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas to the Confederate States, authorizing a $50 million loan, practically confiscating debts due from Southern to Northern citizens, and removing the seat of government from Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond, Virginia. 4 different calls for Southern volunteers had been made, aggregating 82,000 men, and Jefferson Davis's message now proposed to further organize and hold in readiness an army of 100,000. The work of erecting forts and batteries for defense was being rapidly pushed at all points, on the Atlantic coast, on the Potomac, and on the Mississippi and other western streams. For the present, the Confederates were well supplied with cannon and small arms from the captured navy yards at Norfolk and Pensacola, and the 6 or 8 arsenals located in the South. The martial spirit of their people was roused to the highest enthusiasm, and there was no lack of volunteers to fill the companies and regiments which the Confederate legislators authorized Davis to accept, either by regular calls on state executives in accordance with, or singly in defiance of, their central dogma of states' rights, as he might prefer. The secession of the Southern states not only strengthened the rebellion with the arms and supplies stored in the various military and navy depots within their limits, and the fortifications erected for their defense. What was of yet greater help to the revolt, a considerable portion of the officers of the army and navy, perhaps 1/3, abandoned the allegiance which they had sworn to the United States, and, under the false doctrine of the state supremacy taught by Southern leaders, gave their professional skill and experience to the destruction of the government which had educated and honored them. The defection of Robert E. Lee was a conspicuous example, and his loss to the Union in service to the rebel army cannot easily be measured. So also were the similar cases of Adjutant General Cooper and Quartermaster General Johnston. In gratifying contrast stands the steadfast loyalty and devotion of Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, who, though he was a Virginian and loved his native state, never wavered an instant in his allegiance to the flag he had heroically followed in the War of 1812, and triumphantly planted over the capital of Mexico in 1847. Though unable to take the field, he, as general in chief, directed the assembling and first movements of the Union troops. The largest part of the 3 months' regiments were ordered to Washington City as the most important position in a political and most exposed in a military point of view. The great machine of war, once started, moved, as it always does, by its own inherent energy from arming to concentration, from concentration to skirmish and battle. It was not long before Washington was a military camp. Gradually, the hesitation to invade the "sacred soil" of the South faded out under the stern necessity to forestall an invasion of the equally sacred soil of the North, and on May 24th the Union regiments in Washington crossed the Potomac and placed themselves in a great semicircle of formidable earthworks 18 miles long on the Virginia shore, from Chain Bridge to Hunting Creek, below Alexandria. Meanwhile, a secondary concentration of force developed itself at Harper's Ferry, 49 miles northwest of Washington. When, on April 20th, a Union detachment had burned and abandoned the armory at that point, it was at